Order. Alex Ballinger to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered the severe and far-reaching harms of gambling in the United Kingdom. Mr Turner, it is a real pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, your premier chairmanship, I must say. I want to begin this debate by sharing a heartbreaking story of a young man whom we will call Ben. Tragically, last year, at the age of just 19, Ben took his own life. Ben was addicted to gambling. In the 2 months leading up to his tragic suicide, he received 63 promotional emails from a single gambling company. 63 emails, despite his addiction, relentlessly encouraging him to gamble. Despite his attempts to manage his gambling, Ben could not avoid being drawn back in by these persistent efforts and ultimately felt there was no way out. Of course, Ben's story is not an anomaly. In fact, around 40% of gamblers who seek treatment in the UK have considered suicide. In 2023, the government's own National Suicide Prevention Strategy cited gambling as one of the 6 main factors linked to suicide in the UK. Ben's story is one example of how gambling addiction can lead to a tragic end, but Ben represents just one of the approximately 400 people across the UK who lose their lives to gambling each year. Last week, I had the deeply moving experience of meeting families who have lost children to such suicides. Their grief and pain are unimaginable, and their stories underscore the urgent need for further measures to address this crisis. During this meeting, I spoke to Liz. Liz and Charles Ritchie lost their son Jack in November 2017. Jack was aged just 24. He had started gambling when he was 17. It was fixed odds betting terminals that got Jack into gambling. As we know, these terminals are extremely addictive, and Jack found it increasingly difficult to stop. Jack reached out to his parents, and they helped him exclude himself from his local bookmakers. But Jack was then drawn into gambling online. Jack again looked for help, this time installing blocking software on his computer. And over the years, Jack managed to stop gambling for long periods of time. But the ubiquity of gambling marketing during his time at university made it impossible for him to escape. Finally, in 2017, Jack was lured back into gambling and relapsed for the last time. At Jack's inquest, which found that gambling had led to his death, the coroner highlighted the inadequacy of gambling regulation and the poor state of information and treatment. Jack's parents have dedicated their lives to raising awareness of gambling disorders. His dad, Charles, is in the audience for the debate today. Every year, hundreds of people across the UK end their own lives because of gambling. But there are many whose lives are hurt in other ways, through mental ill health, soaring debts, family breakup and more. Of course.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way, and thank you, Mr Turner. Pleasure to share. Thank you. Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Would my honourable friend agree with my perspective as a public health doctor that there is a need for population-level interventions? There is ample evidence of a need for stronger policy and regulatory controls that protects public health and well-being and prevent harm. This is not simply a cultural pastime for people or a leisure facility. It is an addiction and needs to be addressed appropriately.
Alex Ballinger.
Thank you to the member for intervening, and I would wholeheartedly agree with a population approach. It is appropriate in this case, particularly considering the number of people that are harmed and the NHS expertise in this area. So thank you. As a country, we are now experiencing record levels of harm caused by gambling. The most recent statistics from the Gambling Commission show that the scale of harm in the UK is huge, with 2.5% of adults, well over 1 million people, experiencing the most severe gambling harms. The Royal College of Psychiatrists tell me they have seen a 3-fold increase in those referred for gambling treatment since people moved online during the pandemic. And the Dudley-based Gordon Moody charity, who provide gambling treatment centres across the West Midlands, tell me they have seen an increase in referrals, especially amongst younger people. Last year, they received 12,000 applications for their 6-week treatment programme. This clear spike, I will happily give you.
Thank you, and thank my honourable friend for securing this debate and for giving way. According to GambleAware, around 1 in 8 people in my constituency of Shipley engage in gambling behaviour that's deemed to be harmful. And like my other honourable friend, I see gambling as an addiction, as a public health issue, and so therefore welcome the government's commitment to introduce a statutory levy on gambling and putting that £50 million into NHS services. So does my honourable friend agree with me that it is vital that there are NHS services in every part of the country to support those who are suffering from gambling addiction?
I do agree with my honourable friend, and I'm going to come on to the statutory levy in a moment, but it is particularly important that that fund is used not just for treatment, but for prevention, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I get through my speech. Yes, so last year the Gordon Moody charity received 12,000 applications for their 6-week programme. This clear spike in gambling harm goes hand in hand with the increase in online gambling. As people turned to online gambling during the pandemic, they were often engaged in the most harmful forms of gambling. Online slots, for example, have all the characteristics that are associated with the most problematic types of gambling. A high speed of play, making it easier to quickly and repeatedly receive a psychological hit and potentially racking up huge debts. The ease of availability, allowing people 24/7 access to home for their 24/7 access from home at their smartphone, where they are potentially at their most vulnerable, and relentless marketing, where advertising is ever present on social media and video games, as well as offers through email.
John Slinger.
He's speaking very movingly about the tragic cases. I was also at the Gambling with Lives annual forum, and I met Leslie Wade, who tragically lost her son Aaron to gambling-related harm. He was 30 and he had a bright future ahead of him, and his brother lives in my constituency of Rugby. This insidious industry constantly offered Aaron perks and freebies, such as so-called VIP clubs, free tickets to football matches and hospitality. These companies, in my view, are like parasites, preying on people. And so would my honourable friend agree with me that the vast pay packets of the CEOs of some of these companies in this pernicious industry are not worth a single life, not a single life, and we must do all we can to reduce the number of lives that are lost.
Members, that interventions must be short.
I thank the member for his intervention, and I agree that often gambling companies are preying on the most vulnerable in our society, those with the least and with the most to lose. And I wholeheartedly agree that stronger regulation needs to be taken. I'll talk about that somewhat as I go forward. Children and young people are particularly at risk. Just last week, the iNewspaper reported that children playing free mobile phone games are being targeted with gambling advertisements. Such adverts are priming children to gamble as soon as they're old enough to do so. A critical part of tackling gambling harms has to be stronger regulations on marketing, advertising and sponsorship. Both Ben and Jack were drawn back into gambling by the constant offers and inducements to gamble that were seen everywhere. We now cannot watch a football match without being bombarded by gambling adverts. At the opening weekend of the Premier League this season, there were 29,000 gambling messages, a 165% increase on the year before. How is this acceptable with a sport that so many children enjoy?
My honourable friend, good way.
Oh, happily, good way.
Sorry,
Thank you,
yes.
Chair. I was waiting for the Chair to thank you for accepting the intervention. Does my honourable friend agree that we are falling behind other countries with evidence of less harm? Countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy and Spain have chosen almost full bans on gambling, advertising and sponsorship. Does my honourable friend agree we need stronger controls to protect people, especially children, from harmful gambling advertising?
I thank the member for her intervention. I wholeheartedly agree. Many European countries and indeed Australia have put forward much stronger restrictions on gambling advertising, and I think it is very important for the protection of our children that we follow suit. It's also the same on social media. On X and Twitter alone, there are now 1 million gambling adverts every year. And the industry is clearly doubling down in this approach as it spends £1.5 billion a year on gambling advertising in the UK. Whilst there is sometimes an attempt by the gambling industry to frame advertising and marketing as having no connection to harm, there is ample evidence that the marketing increases the use of the most harmful forms of gambling. Online incentivisation schemes, including VIP schemes, bonuses and free spins, are evidence that gambling companies think marketing gets people to gamble in their most profitable and harmful sectors. Advertising and the exposure to gambling cues are the #1 issue for patients who access NHS gambling services. 87% of people with a gambling disorder said that marketing and advertising prompted them to gamble when they otherwise weren't going to. I spoke earlier of Ben, who was contacted more than once a day in the months leading up to his death. This level of contact and pressure must be addressed. It is simply unethical and puts gambling profits above the lives of our young people. I'll happily give way.
Grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. It's an honour to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Turner. Last week, I also had a deeply moving meeting with a constituent whose son, aged just 19, had tragically taken his own life after becoming addicted to online gambling after 6 months and being put under the same sort of advertising pressure that my honourable friend's described. Does my honourable friend agree that it is time for all parts of government to acknowledge that problem gambling has become a public health emergency, that it is not enough for gambling to be left to the DCMS alone to regulate, and that it is time to stop listening to gambling operators' siren voices?
I thank the member for his intervention, and I do agree. I agree the time to act is now. We need stronger regulations now, and we do indeed need a stronger presence of the health system in our response. Please.
I'm grateful, and I would like to congratulate him for securing this important debate. I would, however, like to say that one death is one death too many. However, 22.5 million people in this country gamble, enjoy betting safely without any problems. 42,000 people are employed in betting shops in hard-pressed high streets. Isn't it important that we have regulation, but the regulation is proportional? It is proportional in terms of the impact it has on this industry, which is so important to the United Kingdom.
I thank the member for his intervention, and I agree balance is important, but I think many members, with the situations they've described today, show us that balance is not there at the moment. No one, I think, is suggesting banning traditional forms of gambling, bookmakers, horse racing, lotteries, these sorts of things, but this pernicious advertising and harmful online gambling needs to be properly regulated, and that's not happening at the moment. I will.
I apologise for arriving a little late for his opening remarks. The point is that the occasional flutter on the Grand National or a game of bingo, such as my mother played, is a world away from the gambling he's describing. A statutory levy has been announced. Will he ask the Minister, perhaps, to talk about how that levy will operate? Because it mustn't be controlled by the very people who are doing the harm.
Yep.
I'm delighted the member raises this important point, and this is something that I will be talking about at the moment. I'll come on to that, but I agree with him wholeheartedly. Where was I? Yes, and the public too are concerned about gambling advertising, with opinion polls consistently showing most people in the UK want a clampdown. We fall well behind our countries, as we heard from my colleague before, with the Netherlands, Italy and Spain all having almost full bans on gambling advertising and sponsorship. We can clearly see the boom in online gambling and huge increase in advertising and marketing is leading to an increase in gambling harms. This leads me on to the legislation, which is in urgent need of an update. The last time primary gambling legislation was put forward was with the introduction of the Gambling Act in 2005. This Act established the Gambling Commission with the primary aims of preventing gambling from being a source of crime or disorder, ensuring that gambling was conducted fairly and openly, and protecting children and vulnerable people from being harmed or exploited by gambling companies. This Act was delivered before the rise of online gambling and before smartphones even existed. It is an analogue Act in a digital age and is long in need of an update. I was pleased, however, to see the statutory levy introduced last week by the government, which will generate £100 million from gambling operators to fund the research, prevention and treatment of gambling harms. This is, without a doubt, an important step in ensuring the industry begins to pay for the harm that they cause. Whilst the changes to the levy are welcome, we are lacking clarity on where the money raised through the levy will go with regards to prevention. It is important that prevention commissioning is undertaken independently of the gambling industry. We cannot expect people to access services being commissioned by the industry that they have been harmed or exploited by.
Honourable gentleman, give way.
Jim Dixon.
Thank you very much, Mr Turner, and thank you to the honourable member for giving way. He's just talking about the big step forward that is the levy. Does he agree with me where we talk about prevention, that it also needs to focus on those both who are at immediate risk, but also in the wider sense within our education system and services for young people?
Alex Ballinger.
I thank the member for his intervention, and yes, I agree it's important that prevention needs to work across the piece, but I think that it's more important that the ubiquity of advertising that our young people are exposed to is reduced. They probably don't need to learn about gambling too young, and that prevention should take that into account as well. Whilst the changes to the levy are welcome, we are lacking clarity on where the money raised will go to regarding prevention. Yes, I spoke about this already. It is important that the Prevention Commissioner be from the Department of Health and Social Care, given the synergy between the role and the Department's current expertise in the delivery of similar services. The introduction of the levy is a good first step, but it is just that, a first step. 2 decades on from the Gambling Act, further action is needed to protect individuals and families from harm. The families of Ben and Jack and the thousands of others who have lost someone to gambling-related suicide, as well as the over 1 million people who are experiencing gambling harms right now. I'm a member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Gambling Reform, with members from across the House working to minimise the harms from gambling. I'm pleased to see so many members from that group here today, from both sides. And I wanted to highlight to the Minister some of the proposal the group has been working on. I would ask the Minister to continue to monitor and regularly review the statutory levy on gambling operators. As I already mentioned, it is important this levy should commission preventative work independent of the gambling industry. I would also ask that mandatory affordability checks are implemented, checks that would help prevent individuals from gambling beyond their means, identifying those at risk of financial harm and providing timely interventions. I would ask the Minister to commit to properly investigate every gambling-related suicide. Families like Ben's and Jack's deserve each of these tragedies to be fully examined, to understand the underlying causes and develop better strategies for prevention. I would also encourage the introduction of a gambling ombudsman. An ombudsman would deal with disputes and provide appropriate redress where a customer suffers harm due to the operator's social responsibility failure. And I would strongly push for greater restrictions on gambling advertising, sponsorship and inducements. We need to stop the practices that encourage children to gamble and create unavoidable risks for the over 1 million adults who are already suffering from gambling harm. Many of these challenges can be addressed by reviewing the 2005 Gambling Act in light of the huge technological developments that have happened over the last 2 decades. This would also allow us to follow through on the Labour Party's manifesto commitment to reduce gambling harm. I will have to give way.
Thank you very much to the Honourable Member for giving way and also for organising this very much needed debate today. And could I just quickly say that I have a conflict of interest in that my partner runs the licensing team for a local authority in London. But would the Honourable Member, is the Honourable Member aware of the University of Bristol study in 2021 that found betting shops are 10 times more likely to be in deprived towns than in affluent areas, and that while 10% of food stores are located in the poorest areas, these places are home to 34% of amusement arcades, 30% of bingo venues and 29%
Alex
of adult
Ballinger.
games. And would he join me in asking the Minister to take steps to stop the proliferation
Alex Ballinger.
I thank the member for her intervention. It is very concerning that these sites are concentrated around the most deprived areas in our society. Arguably the areas that are needing greater investment rather than money being extracted from those communities, and I do support her call. The 2005 Act is an analogue law in a digital age. The harms from online gambling have accelerated since COVID, and it is vital that the government acts now to protect gamblers from harm. The stories of Ben and Jack are a stark reminder of the urgent need for comprehensive gambling reform. We cannot wait any longer. Thank you.
Order. I remind members that they should bob if they wish to take part in the debate. I'm going to impose an informal time limit of 2.5 minutes. The question is that this House has considered gambling harms. Sir Ian Duncan Smith.
It's ever a pleasure to see you in one of these debates, even if you're not speaking, as it were, on the subject. And it's great to have you there. So, can I congratulate the honourable gentleman on obtaining this debate? And it's great to see so many people on that side of the House now populating it so that they will take part in the debate. There were times previously when, on both sides, it was a lonely business to push this, but the work that the APPG had done and has done and continues to do, because he will know this because he's also a member of it, it is the continuity of the demand that we bring this industry under a better level of control. It is understood massively that the harms that this industry is capable of need to be checked. It started with the fixed odds betting terminals when we campaigned to get them reduced to a stake of £2. Now, that was attacked, but we got it through, and it has actually led to an improvement dramatically on behaviour in betting shops and in those who go to those things after having had far too much to drink in the evenings. The honourable lady who intervened earlier was quite right to say that the number of betting shops that proliferate around housing estates is something to be seen. Why? Because they want to get those who are either getting their benefits or their wage packet en route home. Some of them never make it home because they end up in the betting shops. And this, of course, makes poverty even worse because the families don't get the money and it's been wasted. So there are real issues. The other point I would say to the honourable gentleman, which is quite right, and we can't go through all the points that he made. He's made them himself, so I won't repeat them. But the reality is that this original legislation is now anyway completely out of date because it was made for an analogue world when it was either the betting shops or nothing at all. Now, of course, it's proliferated into the cyberspace. We know that during lockdown there were huge problems over gambling harms, people sitting in their rooms for hours on end, spending money they didn't have, ending up in massive debt. Suicides took place. He mentioned his constituent, and my heart grieves for the family as well. I've met far too many families who have been in his position, and I have to tell you, if anybody disagrees with that, they should go and meet those who have lost their sons and daughters through this terrible scourge of gambling online late at night, in the slots for the most part. Now, we have taken against us in this argument endlessly is that, well, this will close down racing, horse racing, this will close down the sports. It's nothing to do with that. The idea of betting on a horse race is not the same as sitting in your room late at night on a slot, where literally you are attracted, constantly pounded by the desire to bet more, bet faster, immediately. This will never damage horse racing. It's not the purpose of this. It's not the purpose to damage sport. But honestly, what is happening now with some of those gambling companies in their pursuit now of children through various different algorithms used in children's online games has also got to be stopped. Now, I say to the Minister about this, really, it's important, that the reality is that although the stake limit has now been reduced to £5, we think that it is too high. If for those in betting shops it's reduced to £2, then why not have both at the same level? It seems a peculiar last-minute cop-out to the gambling industry to keep it at £5. It should be brought level with the betting limits on the fixed odds betting terminals. That would make complete sense. And I ask her to go back and speak to her colleagues, and also, by the way, to speak to the Treasury, whose hand is always seen in this whenever this debate comes up, because, of course, they're worried about the revenues. But there are revenues, and then there are revenues. And this particular set of revenues needs to be received with a very careful eye. And I welcome the introduction, really, of the levy. We campaigned for that as well, and I congratulate the government on bringing that through. It is vital. It doesn't just go to charities for their work in helping support those who have suffered as a result of the damage, but it is also vitally important that it goes into research to look to see what is happening, because this is a very fast-moving space now in the online area, and it is wholly feasible, with the amount of money being spent by gambling companies, that they will find ways round what we are trying to do. They will use it in a pernicious way to increase their profits. I have nothing against gambling companies in a free world. They're more than welcome to give access to people who wish to bet on different things. But I do say this. The real problem lies in the fact of the lack of any sense of remorse. When we've had conversations with the gambling industry, the single fact is that they make money when those who gamble lose theirs. And one of the areas we noted was the pursuit of those who have got into the habit of losing sums of money. Although there was great talk about how they should step back and there were ways in which they were going to help them, that by and large was not the case. They pursue them right to the bitter end on the basis that their money is going into their profits. And when you hear about a particular, and I shall not name that individual, who heads up one particular gambling company that was able to give themselves a bonus of £1 billion over 3 years, you ask yourself the question, what is the price of human life that it is only about profit? And I simply say in conclusion, Mr. Turner, that I congratulate the honourable gentleman, I congratulate those who are in the chamber today, and I simply say that the sooner we can get these things on the statute book, the better. I think there is room for improvement in what the government is supposing, but I wish them well on this, and I will certainly be supporting it.
Order. I now impose a formal time limit of 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Dan Carden.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to follow two such accomplished speeches. And I think there is real intelligence across this House in terms of where we need to go now in terms of gambling legislation. Most of my colleagues will know that I have worked over a number of years on the issue of alcohol and drug addiction treatment, and I similarly share the concerns that addiction causes in gambling as well. But I also, Mr. Turner, as you know, have a passion for horse racing, and I want to put into this debate a bit of context to bring the two together, because I think we can all agree that the incessant advertising of gambling, and in particular the online casinos and the most harmful forms of gambling, are the most destructive, and I don't see why we should stand for that any longer. And there is a second levy that is important in this, because fixed odds betting goes back to about the 1960s, and horse racing, which I consider to be a great British sport that I wish to support, and an industry that employs many people and livelihoods, is reliant on a levy from the bookmakers to the horse racing industry. And that levy is applied only to bets that are placed on horse racing. And so there is no risk to racing of dealing with the most harmful forms of gambling in this country. In fact, there can be a benefit to the horse racing industry if this House gets the legislation and the regulation right, that we can reduce the most harmful forms of gambling and encourage the forms of a flutter on a bet, a Yankee on a Saturday, the things that we've done for many generations in this country, so that we actually can redraw the landscape of betting and gaming in the United Kingdom to the benefit of real-life sports and entertainment, away from the online casinos and most addictive forms of gambling, and also, hopefully, through the levy that my honourable friend was talking about, make sure that more money goes into addiction treatment and support for those who so tragically are harmed and, in some of the worst cases, lose their lives to this pernicious thing. Thank you very much.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, can I wish you well in the role you now play as Chair of Westminster Hall, and can I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his own for raising the issue. I was a former, in the last term of Parliament, Vice Chair of the APPG and Gambling Harm, and therefore I have no doubt where I can stand. Can I just commend the lady, Honourable Lady's not here, the Honourable Lady for Neath and Swansea East, for all her work over the years to address gambling. Those of us who knew her from a past, and she's still here by the way, will know that she has done great work. The scale of harm in Great Britain is far more concerning than previously thought, with some 2.5% of the population, equating to nearly 1.3 million people who experience the most severe gambling harms. I make a comment for the Minister's ears and for everyone else, but not because the Minister can maybe directly, but I ask her, would she have some discussion with the Northern Ireland Assembly in relation to it, because they debated this here in January past. But the reason I say, because the rate of gambling addiction in Northern Ireland is 2.3%, above the normal here. The colleagues in the Northern Ireland Assembly held a debate on this at the end of January, and they put forward a number of issues. Paul Frew, the MLA, he highlighted that some 80% of all gambling market activity is now on the internet. So that's where the grey area is, and that's where we need to address the issue. And while online gambling operators licensed by the Gambling Commission can freely advertise in Northern Ireland because of online and broadcast advertising is a reserved matter, our population is afforded no protection by the regulator in Great Britain. So I ask the Minister, please, if you don't mind, would you look at that for me? 30% of 11 to 16-year-olds in Northern Ireland have gambled in one form or another in the last 12 months. So it's clear that the measures place are not protecting our children from harm. The worst time is from midnight to 4 a.m. in the morning. Minister, another issue which I think we need to address, if you don't mind me asking, I conclude with these comments. The need for greater regulation in the mainland and Northern Ireland. We are simply crying out for any updated regulation and legislation to deal with the scourge of gambling. I have young men coming into my office with their mothers owing money left and right and centre to paramilitaries. That's one of our problems back home. And nearly always two reasons: drugs and gambling. We need to do something, particularly in those areas of social deprivation, who are looking for a way out and taking their chance at gambling, which only digs a deeper hole for them to try and get out. So that has to stop. This great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Mr. Chairman, let's do the job together. Thank you.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Chair, and I congratulate my friend for securing this important debate, and condolences to the family of Jack that are here today. Brent has the second highest concentration of gambling premises in London, and it doesn't make our high street better, it makes it considerably worse. Gambling facilities are more accessible than supermarkets, banks or schools in my constituency. 62% of Brent residents are categorised as problem gamblers, over the national average of just 2.9%. Gambling-related harms in Brent costs an estimated £14.3 million annually. And now with betting shops having free Wi-Fi and often given free drinks to young people, it is trying to encourage a younger generation, and I can only see that figure, Mr. Speaker, getting worse. And these products are addictive, and we need to call it out. It is more addictive than heroin or tobacco. And if it was anything else, we'll be saying, how do we change this? What do we do to change this? This is bringing such harms amongst the communities. Yes, people have the right to gamble and have a flutter, but there's serious harms that are being caused by this. And what we need to do is strengthen the licensing power. We've heard today quite powerfully that the legislation is not equipped to handle what's going on now, both online and on our high streets. I want councils to have more of an opportunity to say no to new gambling establishments. I want my constituents' voices to be heard when they say no to further gambling establishments. We've got gambling shops just one shop in between. How is that necessary? And I think that it is absolutely time that we say that this current legislation is not fit for purpose. And if we're serious about growth and regenerating our high streets, we need to start closing down betting shops and definitely not opening new ones. And we do need to strengthen the laws around online gambling.
And Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. It's an honour to serve under your chairmanship. I want to start by thanking the honourable member for Helzo for securing this important debate. Tewkesbury is home to the prestigious and internationally famed Cheltenham Racecourse, one of the largest in the UK. Each year, over 250,000 people visit the racecourse across 4 days of Cheltenham Festival racing, many of whom enjoy betting on the results. A 2023 study conducted by the University of Gloucestershire found that the economic benefit of Cheltenham Festival was an estimated £274 million. Now, I would consider myself a horse racing sceptic, but as a Member of Parliament for Cheltenham Racecourse, I must take a nuanced position. £274 million is an astonishing figure, and I value that contribution. We must also consider, Chair, the associated financial harms and the mental and physical health impacts of gambling to the UK economy, costing £1.4 billion per year. I'm also acutely aware that problem gambling is a very serious public health issue, and I proudly submitted the Liberal Democrats' contribution to the draft Gambling Act Amendment Regulations 2024 just last week, supporting financial caps on the bets made by people online. Public Health England reports that approximately 246,000 people are problem gamblers in England alone, and that a further 2.2 million are at risk. Shockingly, they further report that there are over 400 gambling-related suicides per year. My constituents deserve a Member of Parliament who puts their well-being ahead of the interests of private betting companies, whilst recognising the economic and social contribution of that industry. My residents deserve to be protected from exploitation by betting companies which cannot be trusted, much less expected to self-regulate. Our residents do not need another round of public consultations. They need action. I would like to see significant restrictions on gambling advertising, including but not limited to that which plagues young people's social media feeds and YouTube videos. Gambling firms are at pains to present their industry as symbiotic with sport, deliberately placing their adverts around football broadcasts, around football stadiums and on football shirts. I will give way. Thank you.
The honourable member for giving way. One particular gambling company refers to people when the fun stops, the betting should stop. Does the honourable member agree with me that when the fun stops, it's far too late?
Cameron Thomas.
I thank her for her contribution, and I would absolutely agree. But I also think that it's not up to. We should not be leaving gambling companies to make that statement, and that we should instead take action. As I was saying, gambling is not symbiotic with sport, and these companies should not be allowed to indoctrinate children whose parents, like me, just want to introduce them to the beautiful game. We no longer allow fast food companies to align themselves with sport. We should treat gambling companies precisely the same way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spinner. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. 1 in 15 residents in Greater Manchester face gambling harms. That's 1.5 times higher than the national average. And recent research reveals that the Wigan Borough has the highest referral rate to specialist gambling services in the region. And as we have heard from the most poignant contributions today, these harms can include financial stress, relationship breakdowns, mental health struggles, and tragically, even suicide. So these impacts are not limited to the individuals who gamble. For every person at risk, an average of 6 others are affected. That's family, friends, colleagues. And while gambling may not always be the sole cause of these harms, it often deepens existing vulnerabilities. So the path to recovery can be long and difficult, but it is possible. And this is what I want to focus on my contribution today. So one constituent of mine, David Smith, has a very powerful story, his addiction and recovery. So for 37 years, David's life was controlled by gambling. And he described how it basically ruined his life. It made him a walking nuisance, and they're his words, and ultimately leading him to hit rock bottom. And when he maxed out 5 credit cards in one afternoon, it was that moment that led David to bravely seek help from Gamblers Anonymous. And later he joined GamHive, an incredible organisation in Greater Manchester. So GamHive was founded by individuals who have personal experience of gambling or harm that's been, and that they have, as well as their families, been affected by addiction. So through their collective lived experiences, they are working to break the stigma. Now, I've just given a little contribution, and we've not got enough time to go through David's contribution to how it has affected his life. And I think, you know, all members here would have heard individual constituent stories, and they are so powerful. And I've seen David bring his audience to tears with the story that he has to tell, and that is why I think these groups are so important. And if we are talking about the public levy and what that money can be used for, and we have heard from other contributions, prevention is obviously key, but also the contribution to support groups such as GamHive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Turner. It's been very important, Mr Turner. We've been friends for so long, but I'd like to congratulate you on your elevation to the Speaker's panel. I'd also like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Hales Owen in raising this very important debate, and like my honourable friend for Brent North East. I would like to add my condolences to Jack's family who's in the audience today. I've always been I come from a bookmaking family. My parents were bookmakers, my grandparents were bookmakers. I've always defended the industry because I've always believed, like my honourable friend, the member for Liberal Walton, in the horse racing levy. As someone who loves horses, the investment in equine science has always been something I've been attracted to. But there comes a point, Mr Turner, where you cannot defend the indefensible anymore. We have gone too far. I bought the newspaper on Sunday. My son, like millions of boys and girls across the country loves Erling Haaland. There was a picture on the front page of that paper, and next to it was free £33 bet. I do not want his love of football linked to betting. Equally, I do not believe, and I do have an interest here, I am an administrative steward for the Boxing Board of Control, but I do not believe it's just gambling. It is now embedded in sports programmes we see everywhere. When I drive home from London, I like to listen to the match on Talk Sport. They cut over to a betting expert, telling people of the latest odds. You watch a boxing match, at the end of each round, they're improving the odds on what they're doing. When I was in the betting shop, there was a limit on football betting. You couldn't bet on singles and doubles and trebles. You couldn't do an accumulator. You couldn't bet in-game, which you can now. The truth is, I do not believe the Labour government that brought about the Gambling Act of 2005 envisaged smartphones. It didn't envisage the examples that we've talked about today. But it needs to stop. I see nothing wrong with betting shops the way they are being open. They were sleazy places once to go to. They should be, they do support industry. But I do believe into advertising we've gone too far. They have now taken the space of tobacco companies. Mr Turner, you are more or less the same age as me. You will remember the Embassy Darts Championship, the Embassy Snooker Championship. You will remember the John Player special motor cars on Formula 1 on a Sunday afternoon. The livery of the McLaren cars being the same as a packet of Marlboro cigarettes. Well, it seems now when you see steak going round the circuit, it's the same thing. I really think we need a regulator with real teeth that can shut these companies down and also a change in the law. And I hope that when the Minister stands today, they will talk about the gambling.
Maureen Burke.
Thank you, Mr Turner, and it's also a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'm very grateful to the honourable friend for securing this debate on an issue that I know matters deeply to many of my constituents. I also thank him for the experiences he shared in his opening contribution. Mr Turner, I felt compelled to come along today following a recent advice surgery I had in my constituency. At that surgery, I met my constituent Margaret, who bravely shared with me the impact of gambling had on her life, and more specifically, her son's. The tragedy of this case is that Margaret's son took his own life because of the impact of his gambling addiction. Margaret never knew her son was an addict and only learned of it following his sudden death when she reviewed bank statements, discovering how debt had piled up and ultimately became too much for her son. And I think that speaks to how gambling impacts on people. At first, what is just an occasional trip to the bookies becomes something that is uncontrollable and all-consuming. From this, people suffer in silence, hiding their addiction from their families as the debt grows and the shame deepens. There will be countless people battling this addiction in silence in our communities. The responsibility to intervene and prevent harm can not only be for individuals and their families. Gambling operators must do more. Operators should identify unusual patterns, monitor online activity and recognise regular customers, and acting early to prevent debt spiralling.
Thank you. You're making a wonderful contribution. GamCare's found that there's been exponential growth in online gambling. Over half all callers to them struggle with online gambling, and 60% said online slots were one of the main problems. And we just heard about many people struggling with debt and affordability of gambling. Do you not think the amount of data that online gambling companies have, that we should pursue affordability checks so nobody can gamble more than they can afford?
Maureen Burke.
Yes, I agree with my friend. I do agree that that's something that should be looked at. Margaret's story is heartbreaking, but through her grief, Margaret is determined to act, and I'm proud to be working with her to bring a petition to this House. Before I was elected to this place, Margaret began this campaign with my predecessor, David Linden, and I am pleased that that petition has already secured hundreds of signatures. Margaret's call is that the government introduce tougher regulation and requirements for gambling operators and official institutions. I'm certain that Margaret will be encouraged by the action this UK government is already taking, having announced a statutory level on gambling operators. The money raised from this level will be used to fund research, prevention and health programmes. I look forward to hearing from the Minister today on what further steps this Government intends to take to address the tragic harms caused by gambling, recognising the impact such addiction has not just on the individual but on the families who are too often left picking up the pieces. Thank you.
Jim Dixon.
Thank you very much, Mr Turner. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I'd like to pay tribute to the member for Hales Owen on securing this important debate and the insightful speech he gave to open it. I'm conscious we haven't got huge amounts of time, so I'll focus on a small number of points. In 2023, the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities published its latest report on the economic and social cost of the harms associated with gambling, and that identified 1.76 million people participating in harmful gambling in England, and of these 168,000 are classified as experiencing problem gambling. These are enormous figures. In Dartford, the community I'm privileged to represent in this place, Gamble Aware, estimate that 1 in 33 people hit the PGSI score of 8+. What that means in layman's terms is that they will have experienced adverse consequences from gambling and may have lost control over their behaviour. So I, like other Labour members, were elected on a manifesto committing us to reducing gambling-related harm, and I very much welcome the progress that we're making. The statutory levy and slot stake limits are both impressive steps forward, but there are still a few areas where I, and I'm sure other members, have identified the need for government action. As a football fan, I'm pleased to see the Premier League banning front-of-shirt advertising by gambling companies from the summer of 2026, but anyone who regularly watches or attends matches will know this isn't enough. We need to go further and ban all shirt front and all shirt advertising, as well as perimeter advertising, with other sports needing to follow this lead. And secondly, and perhaps most importantly, I think we need to see reform in how the role of problem gambling is looked at by coroners, where many bereaved families have felt that problems with gambling were simply excluded from consideration. So I would support calls for the government to look at how it might reform the coroner service to ensure that the causes of preventable deaths, such as those linked with gambling, are properly examined and addressed to prevent future deaths, and importantly, that evidence submitted by families is properly interrogated. So I'd like to end by paying tribute to all organisations involved in reducing gambling harms, but particularly gambling with lives, who have put families bereaved by gambling suicide at the heart of their work.
Sarah Coombs.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Turner, and I thank my honourable friend, the member for Hales Owen, for securing this important debate. When I was first involved in this area, the huge focus was on reducing the harm from FOBTs and the fact that people were losing hundreds, if not thousands of pounds in a matter of minutes. That battle was won, but less than 10 years on, it feels like we are living in a different world, with so many bets placed on phones at all hours, encouraged through push notifications, email marketing and free bets. And that's why we've got to do more to make sure the regulation keeps up with reality. I want to just focus on two things: how to make online gambling safer and what should happen in the event of a tragic suicide. Almost 3/4 of callers to the National Gambling Helpline said that they had struggled with online gambling. Last week, a High Court judge found that a well-known gambling firm sent a problem gambler more than 1,300 marketing emails, despite rules meaning that companies shouldn't be advertising to high-risk users. In a world where the data that these companies hold on the users is so granular, I do not believe that they are doing anywhere near what they could do to detect patterns of problem gambling and meaningfully intervene. The High Court ruling makes a link between customer protection and the suppression of marketing, yet the last government told us that there is no causal link between marketing and harm. So can I ask the Minister if the Department will be looking at this again in light of that ruling, and about what further safeguards could be put in place for vulnerable and at-risk users in regards to marketing? Gambling addiction is hard to talk about, and for many people, their gambling habits are a source of shame, and it pushes it further into the dark. Charles is here today, and I met Liz and Charles a long time ago, and they've been powerful campaigners for families affected by suicide. Their charity is calling for an independent investigation into every gambling suicide so that lessons can be learned to feed into regulation and improved public information. But unfortunately, too many families who have lost loved ones through addiction tell stories of how hard it is to get the information from the gambling companies.
So will the Minister work with the Ministry of Justice regarding what happens when a death has occurred and how licensing conditions can encourage operators to be more transparent? To conclude, Mr Chairman, for many people, myself included, gambling means an occasional each-way bet on the Grand National or buying a scratch card. But there are 168,000 people in the West Midlands who say that problem gambling is really devastatingly affecting their lives, and it's for them and for their families that we need to do more.
James Richards. Thank you, Mr Turner. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate my right honourable friend, the member of Hales Owen, for securing this debate. Mr Turner, I can be brief because many of the points have already been made. But similar to my honourable friend and her constituent Margaret, I've only been an MP for 7 months, and in this job you do meet people who are going through difficult times. But I will never forget the meeting that I had with my constituents, Judith Bruni and her friend Liz, who came to my office in Dinnington to tell me about their sons, both of whom were hard-working, honourable, good young men trying to make their way in the world, but both took their own lives far too young as a result of their addiction to gambling. Chris, Judith's son, was talented, he was hard-working, and he took his own life after spiralling, without any of his close family knowing, into the depths of a gambling problem, which in the end meant that he took his own life. And I just want to stress the point that has already been made by my honourable friend, that the trauma for the families didn't end at that point. Because afterwards, both Liz and Judith had to keep fighting for the answers as to how this happened and why this happened against an industry and, frankly, a system which too often closes doors, shuts down, and doesn't look into these very important issues which is affecting hundreds and thousands of people every year. So I would urge the government and the Minister to work with the Ministry of Justice in particular to look at ways in which we can empower and indeed place responsibilities on coroners' courts to really look into these issues in a robust and rigorous manner. Because at the moment we simply do not know the scale of this problem, and we've heard a lot of statistics in this debate which vary because we just don't know what we're dealing with, and until we do, we cannot properly solve it. Thank you.
Your chairship, and very much thank you to my honourable friend for Hales Owen for raising this debate. It's really important and vital that we have this discussion and that hopefully it will lead to some change. A few weeks ago I was visited here by one of my constituents, someone who's already been talked about in this debate, Leslie Wade, whose son, as we've heard, killed himself after engaging with online gambling for an extended period of time. We've already heard how awful that was. What really stood out to me in the story that Leslie told me was how insidious it was and how no one around him knew what he was going through and the stresses that he was going through. Because although the psychology and the biology underlying a lot of gambling addiction is the same as for hard drugs or alcohol, the visual signs are often not there. So families are not seeing the deterioration in people as they're going through this trauma. They're not seeing the warning signs that could lead them to them stepping in. And, you know, Aaron Leslie's son was gambling at work. He was gambling in the pub. He was gambling in his bedroom. And no one knew about this. And largely that's because the online gambling industry is using techniques that are designed to get into people's brains, to mess up with people's brain chemistry. And I believe this is entirely intentional and this is entirely known by these companies. We're not dealing with a situation where these companies are just maximising their product and innovating in a way that's harm-free. So I'm certain that this is a real harm. I'm certain that this is a public health emergency. And that's why I'm very, very keen to see that it's public health that takes the lead in this. DCMS has a role to play, but I don't think it should be the lead department in handling gambling harms and managing the risk. And it's also why I think it's really important that we look at how the health system is responding to this, not just with treatment, but identification and data. So actually changing the way that coroners operate would really help. And just as a counter to some people that have been talking about other areas of the gambling industry, as someone with seaside towns and resorts in my constituency, with great beaches but also lots of amusement arcades, it really stood out to me that when I've been speaking to the people running those arcades, they are very concerned about the wild west that is online and online gambling. And they would like to see that. Yeah.
One of the concerns that the neighbours have is the way that the gambling companies, casinos, can very often find themselves to get planning permission on the high streets of across this great nation. And that's a concern, even though in my term of Newton Ards I did that. But the problem was, even with all the opposition, the planning rules still let them do it. Does he share my concern?
Thank you very much for the honourable member. Yeah, I mean, I do genuinely. I don't believe in prohibition for gambling. I don't believe it's the right approach. I think we can see how that would fail. But I do believe it should be a managed problem. It is a very high-risk area, and we need to look comprehensively at how gambling is organised, legislated for and regulated in this country. So I think we should look at everything. I think it's time to review the legislation, and I very much want there to be a public health lens in this, principally, first and foremost.
Yeah. Lib Dem spokesperson Max Wilkinson.
Thank you, Mr Turner. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I congratulate the Honourable Member for Hales-Owen for securing this important debate. As the MP for Cheltenham, I am no stranger to gambling. And as a Liberal, I believe in holding power to account. That includes powerful and predatory gambling companies. As others have said, it is important at the outset of this debate that we separate the vast majority of gambling on jump racing and harmless flutters, as the Honourable Member for South Holland and the Deepings, who is no longer in his place, mentioned earlier on, from the pernicious practices that are commonplace in the gambling industry. And they're up in our grill 24/7, 365 days a year. Where once sports betting was done in the relatively sterile environment of betting shops, markets can now be accessed 24/7 from the comfort, or in many cases, the absolute discomfort or extreme discomfort of one's own home. A few thumb presses on a screen at 3 a.m. is all that it takes to lay a bet on the Peruvian second division football game you've never heard of, an obscure tennis match in the Far East among players that you've never heard of, or an amateur Australian basketball match. If that's not your bag, then perhaps you might register for online games like bingo or roulette or slots. And that convenient 24/7 availability is advertised to us very forcefully by people with limitless pots of money. It's on the front of football shirts until 2026, and on every touchline as well. It's in every advert break during football matches, often with the pundits who are commentating on that day's game, encouraging us to get involved in the fun. The splicing of journalism and commentary with advertising is something that should give us all pause for thought. Chair, if I might say so without naming anyone in particular, those pundits should think very hard about the difficulties created by their dual role as commentators and at the same time as advocates for the betting industry. This is not an acceptable way for public figures to behave. Yes, I will give way.
People appearing to be one thing and actually being something else. Does my honourable friend agree that 100% of the gambling levy should be given to independent government bodies which are answerable to ministers and to Parliament, and not to charities backed by gambling companies?
Max Wilkinson.
Yes, absolutely, and I think there is a role for a separate levy as well, which I will come on to later on, to support the horse racing industry, which, as I said, needs to be viewed separately from the rest of this. But the government must also think about the broadcasters who screen games and also run their own associated betting operations, because the gap between the reality of the scenarios portrayed in gambling adverts and the reality is nothing short of sinister. In gambling adverts, people are having a great time in the pub with their mates. I will give way in just a moment. And they're having all sorts of, they're in fun scenarios, playing roulette, wearing sharp suits, or in sparkly dresses, with dancing and jolly times being had by all. The reality is that this sort of gambling is in the main far from a social occasion. It is very obviously most undertaken by people who are addicted to gambling apps, losing money at home, alone, often desperate and with nobody to talk to, and I will give way on that point.
Thank you. I have in front of me here a press release from Entain, which announces that Liverpool have become Ladbrokes' official betting partner. The partnership will provide Ladbrokes with a range of exclusive content, opportunities and activations to reward and entertain customers and fans. What does he think those rewards and entertainment will be?
Max Wilkinson.
Well, in most cases, it's a loss, isn't it? A financial loss to the individual who takes part. So these people are unable to talk to their friends and family about the losses and their addiction. They are unable to seek help, despite repeated suggestions that the gambling companies make that when the fun stops, people should stop gambling. The gambling companies know what we in this room know today. Addicts cannot stop. They're not able to, no matter how many times they see a gentle nudge on a fun advert on the television. It's estimated that 48% of people in the UK regularly gamble and that the gambling market is now worth around £15 billion. But as others have said, this is revenue and then there is other revenue, and we must be clear about where this revenue is coming from. Receipts in the previous year, from April to September, total more than £1.7 billion, a 6% increase on the previous year. A study by the University of Liverpool found that over 290,000 betting accounts experienced losses of over £2,000 each year. This leads directly to the loss of life. Public Health England estimates there are 400 gambling-related suicides every year. That's more than one a day. Every single death is a tragedy. Despite this worrying picture, regulatory action has been slow and has lagged behind the technology, the pervasive level of advertising and changing consumer habits. Of course.
The honourable member for giving way. Does he agree with me that we cannot allow the sector to regulate themselves? If allowed to regulate themselves, they will indeed do what benefits them, ensure that it's about profit and not look at the needs of vulnerable users?
Max Wilkinson.
Of course, I started by talking about the need for Liberals to hold power to account, and whether you're a Liberal Democrat or a small L Liberal, and there are many small L Liberals in the room, I'm sure, we know that power does not hold itself to account, and those in positions of power where they have the power to literally print money are not going to regulate themselves. That is obvious to everyone. I'm sure it's obvious to ministers too. But despite that worrying picture, regulatory action has been slow, as I said, and since the 2005 Gambling Act, which others have referenced, we've seen action on fixed odds betting terminals and bans on credit card gambling to reduce harm. That's to be welcomed. The 2023 White Paper sought to modernise regulations, and the new government increased the gambling levy. That's welcome, but more action is urgently needed. The Liberal Democrats believe the remote gaming duty should be raised from 21% to 42%. To provide more funding for initiatives to tackle problem gambling. It's also clear that to tackle problem gambling, we need more restrictions on the bombardment of gambling advertising on all of our screens. A new ombudsman must be set up to provide redress for people wronged by gambling companies, the victims in this discussion. Effective affordability checks must be put in place, and we must start treating those suffering a gambling addiction as a public health problem. It is simply not good enough to continue under the pretence that this form of addiction doesn't require the sort of help and therapy provided to the sufferers of other addictions. That makes no sense. And those asks must be funded by duties on the industry, not taxpayers. An industry which reportedly costs the economy net £1.4 billion per year. Organisations like Gamble Aware and others mentioned so far today have carried out important work in this sector, and that should be commended. While making these changes, which are all about to stick, it is of course important that our heritage asset represented by a horse racing sector, which I represent in Cheltenham, as does my honourable friend from Tewkesbury, they must be given a carrot too. So our racecourses must be placed on a level playing field with their international competitors, and I know ministers are looking at this. We previously have discussed in this room reforms to the gambling levy to better provide support for our domestic racecourses. Could the Minister update us on her discussions on that point? But that is not the main point of this debate today, as I've been very clear on in what I've said. In conclusion, Chair, action to prevent harm to problem gamblers is long overdue. The sector requires widespread reform so the bombardment of gambling adverts luring people into 24/7 betting cycles is ended. We cannot continue to ignore this problem that is costing our economy, splitting families and causing so much unnecessary suffering.
Shadow Minister Louis French.
Thank you, Mr Turner. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. I would also like to thank the honourable member for Howells Owen for securing this debate today on a very important and sensitive issue. As we have heard already, betting and gaming are key economic contributors. Last year, Ernst Young reported that the industry supported more than 100,000 jobs, generated over £4 billion in tax revenue and contributed close to £7 billion to the wider economy. Across all forms of gambling, more than 22.5 million adults in Britain enjoy a flutter every single month and generate almost £11 billion in gross gambling yield every year. The vast majority of this is done safely, supported by measures enacted by regulated operators and enforced by the Gambling Commission. However, there are a number of people who have suffered harm because of gambling, whether that is financial harm or, in the tragic cases, suicide, as we've heard about today, and my heart really does go out to all those families impacted. We must continue to take this seriously and provide the best support that we can. For example, the current voluntary system funds a vital network of charities to support problem gamblers. We are fortunate in the United Kingdom that these rates of problem gambling are relatively low compared to European countries. For example, Greece has a problem gambling rate of 2.7%, France has a rate of 2.9%, and the Czech Republic has a rate of 4.5%. Whereas, Mr Chairman, the United Kingdom problem gambling rate almost halved from 2016 to 2023, and it now sits at 0.4% according to the gold standard NHS Health Survey. Of course, we would all like to see this rate at zero, which is why, as honourable and right honourable members will know, the sector already contributes and why we must get the balance right in this area of legislation. Over the last 4 years, the sector has contributed more than £170 million to research, prevention and the treatment of gambling harm, with more than £50 million being volunteered in the last year alone. This money funds a vital network of charities to support problem gamblers, a network that cares for approximately 85% of all problem gamblers receiving treatment in Britain. However, this work is now being put into doubt by the government. The gambling levy regulations debated by the Minister and I, amongst other colleagues, in a DL committee last week risked the much-needed funding stopping in the short term as the transition to a new statutory levy takes place. The new regulations will lead to a double levy this year, with the voluntary levy still in place and the statutory levy taxing gross gambling yield backdated to April last year. Not only that, but this first levy period is being charged at 133% the rate for subsequent years. Even those with the purest intentions, including those providing the current prevention and treatment programmes, are aware of the enormous damage that this could do. There are clear risks of a gap in funding from the ending of the voluntary levy in April to the first collection of the statutory levy in October. As businesses, the sector will have to take decisions to survive Labour's tax rises, and this could include minimising voluntary payments to the current minimum of just £1 for this year. Mr Chairman, I raised this issue in our debate last week, but the Minister did not give me or the sector an answer, and I wonder if she will answer this vital question today. How will prevention and treatment programmes be funded when the voluntary funding is minimised but the statutory levy is yet to be collected or distributed? The sector was broadly supportive of the statutory levy proposed under the previous government, but the way in which it has been introduced at higher rates than those discussed with the department previously to the sector means that there is deep concern from both gambling businesses and treatment charities about the outcomes and unintended consequences. Will the Minister tell us today here how many people she thinks will lose out on vital treatment in that time? I know she is not the gambling minister, but she is accountable for gambling to us in the Commons. And as I set out last week, there are many concerns across the sector about the lack of engagement coming forward. Over several months where I've asked questions, I've yet to receive any response from either the minister or the gambling minister in the other place. Why is the government leaving the betting and gaming sector in the dark? And will she finally give us the answers we've all been waiting so patiently for? What about Gamble Aware, who have stated that they need the confirmation of its funding for the period to April 2026, when the new system will be fully in place? I'm sure they have also told the department this, but they are becoming increasingly urgent and uncertain about how they commission services going forward, including commissioning via the crucial National Gambling Support Network, which helps fund many of those charities that I've already highlighted across the sector. It needs clarity, Mr Chairman. Not only is the government consciously leaving the prevention and treatment of gambling harm in a state of uncertainty, but the higher rates of the levy now to be charged will also have further implications. The higher costs on companies will lead to business closures and job losses, particularly amongst smaller firms, as well as a reduction in tax revenue for the His Majesty's Treasury, and will have a knock-on effect of up to £60 million in business rates that are currently flowing to local authority. This, in turn, will have a dual impact. Firstly, it will likely increase participation rates in the black market, where no regulations or safeguards apply, and no levy revenue will be generated. As honourable and right honourable members will know, black markets are created when gambling customers cannot access products or, more pertinently, find those products highly restricted in their domestically regulated market. No amount of anti-black market measures will prevent a black market from forming if customers cannot gamble enjoyable with limited frictions. Here in the United Kingdom, we have historically enjoyed a relatively low level of black market participation, but there is a clear evidence that this is a growing risk, and there are clear reasons why. Price frictions in bonuses, free bets and other financial limits such as affordability checks not being enforced properly. Mr Chairman, we are reaching a tipping point of the government's own making, a point at which those most at risk from gambling harm will find themselves unable to wean themselves off gambling in a responsible, monitored way, but instead they will turn to illicit bookies and international websites to meet their needs. A report by Regulus Partners confirms this, stating that on the current pattern of increasing consumer friction in the domestically regulated market, international experience shows Britain's illegal gambling leakage could more than double. If this happens, the most at risk will be left from the furthest from the help they desperately need. And this will also continue to damage British horse racing, which I know has been mentioned by honourable colleagues already today. But there is a middle ground. Allowing players to engage with betting and gaming safely, with plenty of warnings and signposting to the help they can receive, without pushing the cost of safe and legal betting to such a height that participants choose to exit the market in favour of cheaper prices and better odds in the unregulated market. This would undermine efforts to make gambling safer, forcing more players and more money into unregulated providers who do not need to comply with regulations around safer play. I asked the Minister several questions last week, Mr Chairman, and I will ask them again today to see if she's had time to confer with her colleagues. So firstly, who in government will be setting the strategic direction and who is ultimately accountable for any issues arriving with the levy? Is it ministers in her department, the Health Department or in the Treasury? Secondly, how will services be commissioned and value for money ensured? If commissioning will primarily be led by the NHS, what support will be provided to charities to ensure that any future tendering processes do not risk their expertise being lost? Who decides who sits on any advisory boards for the levy, and how will the government ensure all views are being heard rather than just vested interests? Will the government ensure that charities currently being funded by the voluntary levy are not frozen out by the more anti-gambling parts of the sector? Are the government looking to expand residential treatment currently provided by excellent charities such as Gordon Moody? Her department has announced that the Gambling Commission will not have carte blanche in terms of its approach, which I know will be a relief to many in the sector. But what does this mean in practice? How will the government be holding the Commission to account? Finally, Mr Chairman, I want to place on record my thanks to the many amazing charities such as Gordon Moody, Deal Me Out and others in the room today who continue to do fantastic work to help people turn their lives around. They are at the forefront of helping those who are suffering the harmful effects from their gambling and should be the ones we keep in our minds throughout these discussions on an appropriate balance to ensure safe gambling across the country. So will the Minister reassure those in the room now and those watching closely away from here that she will make sure that her ministerial colleagues meets them, listens to them and puts in practice their expertise in this field? They know what they are talking about, does the government? Thank you.
Before I call the Minister, can I remind her that I'd like very much to allow Alex Ballinger 2 minutes to wind up at the very end. Minister Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you. Well, it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Turner. May I congratulate you on your elevated position, and I will indeed heed your comments on the time. I'd like to, of course, begin by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Halesowen, on securing this important debate on gambling at heart. And it is, of course, a real pleasure to welcome him in leading with what I believe is his first Westminster Hall debate. I would also like to begin by referring to my register of interest, having taken part in a charity bet last April. Now, my honourable friend spoke movingly, indeed, as did members across the House, about those who have suffered from gambling-related harm and suicide and those who have sadly lost their lives. I would like to extend both mine I'll just make some progress and then I will. I'd like to extend both mine and the government's sympathies to all those who are affected by these issues.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for giving me way. Organisations such as Gordon Moody in my constituency of Dudley provide essential and invaluable residential treatment for individuals suffering from severe gambling addiction, providing mental health services and advice about how to detangle addiction. How is the government supporting these organisations in their efforts to prevent gambling-related suicide? And does the Minister agree that an expansion of government-backed rehabilitation services, especially focused on children, is essential?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her point, and I have seen firsthand the impact of gambling-related harms. As Shadow Minister for Gambling, I spoke directly to individuals and families directly impacted by such harm, including visiting the Gordon Moody Treatment Centre, which I believe is in her constituency, speaking to families in Parliament and hosting roundtables with the prevention sector. And indeed, the Minister for Gambling regularly engages with those with lived experience of gambling harm. Today, I will set out the government's position on gambling-related harm and the important action we're taking to reduce it. Indeed, framing today's debate is the 2023 Gambling White Paper published by the last government. This laid the foundations for a once-in-a-generation gambling reform, working with the industry to modernise regulation, as well as implementing meaningful changes to protect people from gambling-related harm. Before I go on to do that, I'm going to respond to some of the points made by honourable members
and if I don't cover them all now, I will throughout the course of my speech. So to the honourable member whose debate in which this is, and indeed others, he asked when the statutory levy would be reviewed. That will happen within 5 years. Of course, affordability checks are being piloted. The Ombudsman was in, the voluntary Ombudsman was in the White Paper, and the Minister for Gambling will update shortly. I would, of course, argue the government is acting to protect those from harm and is indeed in implementing the White Paper, fulfilling our manifesto commitment to reduce harm. The member for Strangford raised a really important question about Northern Ireland. I'm always keen to meet with my counterparts. I'm very pleased to write to him, and I'd just like to say that the DCMS stands ready to work with the Northern Irish Executive to strengthen regulation if that is helpful. The member for Liverpool Walton is a strong champion for horse racing, and both he and I believe the member for Cheltenham, I think, but certainly other members raised the important issue of horse racing. I will reflect them to the Minister for Gambling. The government's position is they should get round the table and come to a voluntary deal. Now, I'd just like to briefly respond to the Shadow Minister. He did say that the levy was in jeopardy. I would say gently to him, the only thing putting it in jeopardy is him voting against it, which he did last week, which is rather curious given it was his Conservative government, obviously, that published it. I will, of course, give way to him, yes.
The Minister will be well aware, Mr Chairman, the reason for us voting against the levy, it was not the principle of the levy, as she just acknowledged. It was designed by the previous government. It's how it's been changed by the new government and the risks that I've outlined both my questions today. Thank you.
Minister.
I'm grateful, and I'm going to come on to answer some of those there, but in the interest of time, I will endeavour that the Minister for Gambling writes to him with a full response. So he did ask about operators paying more in the first year. It's simply not correct. The levy is charged at a flat rate based on previous year's profits. We believe this is the fairest and most sustainable way forward. Operators' first levy payments will be based on profits reported to the Gambling Commission via regulatory returns. The Commission changed the returns process for non-lottery licences in July last year, and as such, operators' first levy payment is based on 3 quarters worth of data multiplied by 1.33 to get the full year. In terms of the assessment the government's made about anyone losing out on treatment in the transition period, we are clear that operators must maintain the level of contributions to the National Gambling Support Network to ensure it has the funding it needs, and we have received reassurances from the industry that that will happen, and I will, as I've just said, commit to writing to him, or the Minister for Gambling will write to him. In the interest of time, I want to move on to make some progress on the question before us. And so we know that the vast majority of people who gamble do so safely. Indeed, half of adults gamble each month, and the Shadow Minister, and I believe also the member for Easington, spoke about the economic contribution, the contribution of jobs, and I won't repeat those comments. However, 300,000 people in Great Britain are estimated to be experiencing problem gambling, and it is clear from today's debate that many of us share the same commitment to do more to protect those people who are experiencing this harm, especially given the significant changes that we have seen in the sector in recent years. It is in this context that the government is committed to taking forward white paper measures like new protections on marketing and bonuses, financial risk checks to prevent unaffordable gambling, and allowing consumers to seek redress from gambling operators via an ombudsman, which has been discussed today. We will continue to work with industry, the third sector and the Gambling Commission to ensure these reforms are proportionate, targeted and effective. I will give way, yeah.
I'm very grateful to the Minister. Just to reflect some of the points that were made early on in the debate, I wonder if the department will be looking at lotteries, pools and sports betting differently to how it looks at what we know as some of the most harmful online addictive forms of gambling, because I actually think there's an opportunity for government to shape how gambling goes forward in this country.
Minister.
Well, I'd be very happy to discuss that point with the Honourable Member. He will know, obviously, the levy is proportionate to the sort of product, so it obviously is different for different products, but happy to have a conversation with him, or indeed the Minister for Gambling will do. Indeed, the work has already begun with regulations for state limits for online slots, and the statutory gambling levy was debated last week, has been referenced. I am pleased to report that this House has approved both these statutory instruments, and these statutory instruments will now be considered in the other place next week. I'd like to move on to talk briefly about state limits for online slots, which was the first of those statutory instruments, providing an important and proportionate intervention aimed at better protecting people most risk of gambling-related harm. Online slots are the highest risk and the fastest growing gambling product. However, there are currently no statutory state limits for online slot games, unlike their land-based counterparts. As slots' popularity grows, so does the risk for vulnerable people. The limit builds on earlier protections introduced by the Gambling Commission, and the new regulation introduces statutory maximum state limits on online slots games of £5 per game cycle for adults aged 25 and over, and £2 per game cycle for young adults aged 18 to 24. These limits will bolster existing safer game design requirements to ensure that online slots games are safer to play than ever. I have heard what some members have said about £5 being too high. I think it's worth noting the average stake on online slots is 60 pence. The evidence shows that people are staking high amounts are more likely to be experiencing gambling harm. The £5 stake limit is a targeted intervention to protect those most at risk of gambling harm and unaffordable losses. I will give way, yes.
I'm not quite sure how the logic works on this. We introduced a £2 limit in the betting shops, but for some reason, where we think the harms are greatest, we've introduced a limit which is higher. Which one is wrong, apparently?
Minister.
I'd made a note of his speech, and I was just coming on to address some of the points which he may or may not agree with. Before I move on to say that, I obviously pay tribute to the work he's done. I know he's a very experienced member on this issue and was really instrumental in actually forming the white paper. Play on land-based gaming machines is often anonymous. Online gambling is more accessible to many. There can be extra protections afforded to account-based online play, such as monitoring data for signs of harm, safer gambling checks, and checks for financial risks. I will reflect his comments to the Gambling Minister. And so I'd like to move on now to discuss the statutory levy. The government is also for the first time introducing a statutory gambling levy to fund research, prevention and treatment of gambling-related harm. The levy represents a watershed moment, a significant uplift in the investment dedicated in this area, greater government oversight and a renewed commitment to further understanding, tackling and treating gambling harms. The statutory levy will be charged to all licensed gambling operators, replacing and building on the successes of the current system based on voluntary donations. The existing system for support and treatment would not have been possible without the financial support of the industry, but the time is now right to improve and expand the system to put levels of funding on a more sustainable footing and the trust in the system beyond doubt. We have designed the levy to be charged in such a way which recognises the higher levels of harm associated with some online products and higher operating costs in the land-based sector. This will guarantee that all operators are paying their fair share while ensuring that any impacts are proportionate. We expect the levy to raise around £100 million every year for research, prevention and treatment of gambling-related harm. 20% of funding will be directed for research, which will be overseen by UKRI to deliver a bespoke research programme on gambling. 30% of funding will be allocated to developing a comprehensive approach to prevention and early intervention, and the remaining 50% will be allocated for treatment. Overseen by NHS England and appropriate bodies in Scotland and Wales, a full treatment pathway from referral and triage through to aftercare will be commissioned. This will not only deliver a significant uplift in investment for areas relating to research and prevention and treatment of gambling-related harm, but it will also provide robust government oversight and mobilise world-leading expertise among our public bodies. Now, I know many members are keen to know more who will lead on prevention. Indeed, the member for Hales-Owen asked this question. This is a very complex but important area, and we want to take the time to get it right. We are grateful to the funding provided by the gambling sector while the statutory levy was not in place. However, we've taken note of members' desire to know what comes next, and I will dedicate greater investment for prevention. I know the Minister for Gambling will announce her decision on prevention very soon. The levy represents the beginning of a new phase for gambling harm reduction, where people in our country are better protected from and aware of the risks of harmful gambling, and it has wide support across the sector. In the interest of time, I would like to move on to acknowledge members' comments regarding gambling-related suicide. I'm aware of the devastating impact that harmful gambling can have, including some instances of suicide. A single instance of this is one too many. We are absolutely committed to working cross-government on this issue, as some members have asked, including working with the Department of Health and Social Care as part of its work to take forward the suicide prevention strategy. We will continue to work with the Gambling Commission to develop the evidence base on gambling-related suicide through through its gambling survey of Great Britain. The member for West Bromwich and others raised the point on coroners. I recognise the important role that coroners currently play in assessing the facts behind instances of suicide. Coroners are already required to make a report to a person or organisation where they think action could be taken to prevent future deaths. It is beyond the coroner's power to investigate why a death occurred. Requiring coroners to do so would turn a fact-finding process into a subjective judgment, which would be inappropriate and potentially inconsistent. However, we will continue to explore possible options in this area alongside introducing landmark reform to prevent harm before it occurs and establish a comprehensive treatment system for those who need it. Many members have raised the issue of advertising. I acknowledge the concerns that have been raised today around advertising. For those who are already suffering from gambling-related harm, advertising can have a disproportionate impact, and we know that members are particularly concerned about the potential impact on children and young people. Key sports bodies are raising standards in this area. The gambling sponsorship codes of conduct brought in voluntarily by sporting bodies last year are a positive step forward. The Premier League's decision to ban front-of-shirt gambling sponsors from the end of next season was also a welcome step. We will be monitoring these reforms to assess what impact they are having on the ground. I understand that gambling operators may feel that their own messaging and volume ads are appropriate. The Independent Advertising Standards Authority has existing robust rules in place to ensure gambling adverts, wherever they appear, are socially responsible, and advertising is an advantage that regulator operators have over the unlicensed sector. However, I won't in the interest of time. However, the issue of appropriate volume needs to be looked at in aggregate and thought about from the perspective of the public, especially children. We expect industry to take the initiative on this by working cross-industry with sporting bodies and with academics on harm prevention. Alongside the volume, this government is eager to see improvements made to safer gambling messages. It is clear that the industry ownership of safer gambling messages is not sustainable in the long term, and we are working on this issue with the Department of Health and Social Care and the Gambling Commission to develop a new approach to messaging. We expect to see industry make improvements in this space in the meantime, and we'll be monitoring the impact of the sector's work and will step in if necessary. And so, to conclude, this government is committed to protecting the most vulnerable in society from gambling harm. Together with the Gambling Commission, we have made good progress on implementing the measures in the Gambling White Paper. We've taken action on online slots and the levy, and will continue to implement measures further. I'm grateful for the important contributions made by members today. I thank you for sharing the stories you have, illustrating why the issue is so important, and for the constructive discussion. And it is a pleasure to conclude this debate.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to start this round up by paying tribute to Liz and Charles from Gambling with Lives, who've done so much to support the measures to protect people that are suffering from gambling harms, and have worked with so many members across the House on this campaign for so many years. So thank you. I'd also like to talk to some of the points raised by my colleagues here. Firstly, to the member for Chingford and Woodford, and to thank him for his long work on this campaign. It's been a pleasure to join your all-party group, sir, and I appreciate the work you've done on fixed odds betting terminals. And to the member from Liverpool Walton, and your long work on addiction, it's very important and relevant to this debate. So thank you for comparing gambling to other types of addiction. I think that is important. To the member for Strangford, for raising the absence of proper legislation in Northern Ireland on this issue, and I think that is something that I'm glad the Minister is looking at. To the member for Brent East, for talking about the proliferation of gambling shops in her constituency and how they are concentrated in the areas of most deprivation, which is clearly a challenge that other members have spoken about. To the member for Tewkesbury, talking about the benefits of horse racing in his constituency, but also comparing that with the harms of more damaging and difficult forms of online gambling. For the member for Lee and Atherton, talking about the challenges in Greater Manchester, and her constituent David Smith, talking about the example of the treatment path that he took. The member for Caerphilly, talking about the connection very powerfully between gambling and sport, and how so many gambling commentators are taking advantage of their position, in my view, to push this very harmful practice on people that are just there to enjoy a game of football or otherwise. The member for Glasgow North East, for talking about the challenges around debt and her constituents' problems and the campaign that she's pushing forward. The member for Dartford, about the economic and social costs of gambling, which we have heard from the Shadow Minister and others about the economic benefits, but there are huge economic costs associated with the harms that we should reflect on. The member for West Bromwich and her campaign to make online gambling safer. We're neighbours, we agree on many of these issues and have similar challenges, but I certainly agree with her to encourage this to be a more transparent process from the gambling industry. To the member for Rother Valley, who talked about his constituents, Judith and Liz, and the very painful situation they've gone through. It's always so difficult to hear these stories, so thank you for championing that. The member for Sittingbourne and Sheppey for talking about the challenges for coastal areas and how there are different grades of harms and types of gambling, and that sometimes challenging and tackling more difficult online forms may be a benefit for those less dangerous forms that he has in his constituency. The member for Cheltenham for talking again about horse racing, but comparing that to the difficult harms that people face and the addiction to gambling apps and online gambling, which many of us see amongst younger people.
With my honourable friend, thank my honourable friend for giving way. I just wondered what he thought about online games that are not gambling, but whereby you lose a turn and then you're immediately presented with something like a roulette wheel on an online app to kind of win an extra game, and whether you felt that that was normalising gambling.
It is a concern, and I think we might need another debate to talk about the effect of online games on children. But I welcome the Minister's comments. Thank you for the work that you've been doing on this alongside the Gambling Minister. I think more needs to be done. We need to have a stronger push on gambling marketing, sponsorship.
Order, order. Thank you. Right. Thank you very much, Louis. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Don. Thank you. Don't worry. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Right, we need to crack on, don't we?
Yeah, we're going to go Gregory Campbell's here.
Gregory Campbell's here. Is the Minister here?